Welcome, everybody, to the second in a four-part series of Lunch and Learn, the virtual event. This event is part of the League of Women Voters of Arizona Legislative Week events. For many years, the League has had a legislative day, and about 6 years ago, probably, we started making it into a week-long experience for our members so that they could participate in virtual sessions that would help them understand what we are going to be working on, advocating for, and issues that are in front of the legislature. We also have been able to use the virtual event to bring a lot of our new members on board and be far more active in our advocacy space. With that being said, a very warm welcome to everybody. If you're from the East Coast, Spencer, a warm welcome to you. It is nice and pleasant here today. My name is Penny Sharan. I'm the president-elect for the League of Women Voters of Arizona and the state advocacy chair. On this call with me is also Gittel Sears, who is the vice chair for the state advocacy. Today's program is being recorded, and post-program, we will share this with everyone who's registered. As a reminder, every week during the legislative week, we send out a call to action. We will be sharing all of the recordings that we have embarked on through this Lunch and Learn virtual event. Yesterday's event was a focus on ballot initiatives, and really our theme was, and they can do that, to bring attention to our members on the power that the legislature can use in order to put forward often nonsensical initiatives to the voters. And today's event is really an important event because it has been in the news. Those of us who've been working in this advocacy space are familiar with this, but who you're going to hear from are the real experts. And I am so delighted that we have this afternoon with us three absolutely excellent presenters on this topic. We couldn't have had better partners to help us on this. We're going to lead off with Spencer Klein, who's the Senior Legal Counsel for the Campaign Legal Center. And then our dear, dear friends, Alex Collada and Brian Garcia from All Voting is Local. And as an extra point for Alex is also a member of the League of Women Voters, and we're so proud of the work he does, and we're very, very, very honored and excited about the work we do with All Voting is Local in Arizona. With that being said, I'm going to introduce Spencer. Spencer Klein works as the Senior Counsel for Policy at Campaign Legal Center, focusing on implementation of the new Electoral Count Reform Act, known also as ECRA. And prior to joining the Campaign Legal Center, Spencer practiced voting rights and election law litigation at a law firm. Spencer, I must tell you, I did a search on ECRA, and what I got is some kind of commercial reform act. And I thought, wait a minute, what is that? Okay. So if people look for ECRA, be careful you're not going down a rabbit hole around commercial reform, which, is not part of our discussion today. I want to share with you all how much delight I take in introducing Alex, okay? Alex is a wonderful, wonderful partner with us. Alex and I go round and round regarding whether my name is really Penny or Pinky, and I had to bring that in because we need to have a little humor today when we talk about this very difficult topic. Alex has really such deep history in fighting for voting rights. people's rights. He brings in such a depth of experience in the work he did as a community advocate and legal representation for people who have a lot less to live with than we all do. So I'm a big admirer of the work he's done and the work he continues to do, okay? He is really focused on building community power. We see that as the league. He's very data-driven in his advocacy and about strategic communications. This is where we have the most funnest conversations, if you will, as to what is the appropriate messaging when both of us have our hair on fire and are really mad about something that the legislature is bringing forward. You know, he brings in about 30 years as an anti-poverty lawyer and more than 20 years in nonprofit as an executive director and a nonprofit consultant. Now, All Voting is Local exists to expose and dismantle threats to voter freedom. You'll see that in much of the work we do with them and all of the publications. Another partner with us on this is Brian from All Voting Local, Rosemary Avia, and of course, Amanda. And Amanda and I have hosted a number of events. And so our partnership with the All Voting Local in Arizona is deep, and we expect it to sustain for the long haul, okay? This is what Alex tells me. We're fighting back. Instead of letting state and local officials strip away unchecked our ability to vote, every day we rise in our power to be proactive, not reactive. Our work is nonpartisan and focuses on 3 areas to ensure that the right to vote belongs to us all: growing grassroots power, voter registration and voting, and vote counting and election certification. We fight to dismantle barriers to the ballot well before the next election and ensure the results are respected so that every voter's voice is heard. So Alex, as always, I'm grateful for your presence and the insight that you will be sharing with us. I'd like to introduce Brian Garcia. Brian, our partnership is rather recent, but I've been so excited to work with you on so many fronts. I want to tell a little narrative of Brian, which is not in his resume, which is Brian spends untold hours sitting in county meetings, listening to crazy propositions, to hand count ballots and so on. And may I say, I admire that you maintained your sanity. So thank you for that very hard work that you do. And when we talk about county, we're not talking about in comfortable places like Maricopa. We're talking about Yavapai. We're talking about Navajo. We're talking about Cochise. All the places where it's not that comfortable to be in those meetings. So thank you. He was born and raised in Arizona. Yay, Brian. He's originally from El Salvador and Mexico. His parents are from El Salvador and Mexico. He's a member of the Pascua Yaqui tribe. If I mutilated that, we'll have a chat later on, okay? Prior to joining All Voting is Local, Garcia worked as a staff attorney for the Florence Immigrant and Refugee Rights Project, okay, where he represented unaccompanied children. He also worked for the U.S. House of Reps, the Salt River Pima Maricopa Indian Community, the Pascua Yaqui Tribe, and the Arizona Secretary of State. Brian, we're very, very fortunate to have you on this call. Guess what? He was in the Tempe Union High School governing board. Yay, Brian. That's really local activism, if you will. Okay. With that, I'm going to move on because I want to give our presenters all the time they need to walk through tell us what's going on and what's going to happen with the ECRA. But as always, I've got to root our presentation in the league and our league history and what we do and why, when we take action, what is that rooted in? What's the foundation? We celebrated on February 14th, 104 years. That was our birthday. It's also the date of Arizona statehood. So we've been around a long time. Some of us, sometimes we wake up in the morning and feel all the 104 years, but sometimes We have young people so passionate, they just add to all of the energy that we're bringing to this work. Our mission is empowering voters and defending democracy. We envision a democracy where every person has the right, the desire, and the knowledge and the confidence to participate. And I would like to tell you, peel back those words just a little bit. In order for a person to have a desire, and the right, we need to be sure we're educating them. The League has done a lot of work, years and years and years, to really educate people about why you should vote and why not voting is voting. The right, we fight constantly with all our coalition partners that if they have a right to vote, they have a right to exercise that vote. And we want them to have knowledge. We want them to be informed voters. This is where the League does deep work in educating the voters. We have a phenomenal platform called the, if you have your video on, please, I'm going to ask you to turn off your video. Thank you. Okay. We also have a platform, Vote 411, which is our digital platform to educate the voter about elections, candidates, and ballot issues. Now, one of the things that is not well understood is that the League, the way we arrive at action is only when we've studied a position, and sometimes our studies take about 2 years. So there are times when new members will say, why isn't the League acting on this issue? It's because we don't actually have a studied position. And the League is very principled about that. We're also very principled about speaking with one voice, that if we speak as a League, that we have consensus, and that consensus is arrived at through the studies that we do, which allows us to arrive at a position. Now, although we've been an advocacy organization from our get-go as the suffragette movement, it's only in 1960 we started formalizing the way in which we articulated our positions and used those to act and take action. And the document that we use that is updated every 2 years is called Impact on Issues. Gital, if you get a moment to put that in the chat, it'll be wonderful for everyone to have a link with those, okay? Positions are arrived at the national level, at the state level, and at the local level. And each level, we are a federated system. We have the National League, we have the state leagues, and we have local leagues. But at each level, that level of league has jurisdiction only for that level of municipality. So local leagues can only act on positions which might have been arrived at by national or state, but they can only act in advocacy at the local municipalities and counties. The state acts at the state level, and the national acts at the federal level. None of us at the state or local can act at the federal level without the approval of national. So this topic we are bringing to you all has both national and local and state well, definitely national and state implications. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Spencer first to talk about the ECRA, and then Alex and Brian, I am assuming you figured out a tag team and you'll tell me who goes first, okay? All right, thank you, Spencer, take it away.
All right, Penny, thank you for that wonderful introduction. I just want to say what an honor it is to be here speaking to all of you here. And at a moment where I think there's a great deal to be proud of in terms of what Arizona has done in this space. And so I'm going to start off by talking about the federal legislation that we're concerned with here. That's currently displayed up on the screen, the Electoral Count Reform Act, ECRA. Started to hear people call it ECRA as well. Either one will go, Penny. I think it's a good point. You got to be careful, right, with the sort of branding on this, because there's some sort of commercial legislation that intersects with this. But this is specifically about the way presidential electoral votes get cast and counted, from the electors in the states to Congress. Right? This is a process that I think a great many of us, myself included, had limited familiarity. I understood that there were results that got reported on the news and that you wanted to get 270 votes. And if you could do that, you became president. But underlying this, since the late 19th century, and prior to that as well, there is a somewhat Byzantine process that is involved. And the ECRA aims to update those laws and those somewhat antiquated processes. Now, we unfortunately all became somewhat familiar with some of the issues in these laws. I'm speaking, of course, about January 6th, 2021 and the lead up to that. Now, that is unquestionably what the primary impetus was for this new law. The goal here is to ensure that the counting and casting of presidential electoral votes goes smoothly. The overarching theme here, the way I like to conceptualize of this, and what Arizona has done this month, just this month, is an exercise in what is harm minimization, or rather risk minimization. The idea is to anticipate what potential issues may arise and do whatever possible to prevent them. Now, it may be that some of these issues may not arise in 2024, but the goal is that any potential issue that can come up, there is a contingency for. And I think that's what's worth keeping in mind when you think about the ECRA, is it is about anticipating potential harms that might arise and putting in place the right preventative measures to ensure they don't come to pass. So I'm going to talk about what the major reforms are first. So most crucial to Arizona, unquestionably, is that the ECRA sets a firm certification deadline of 6 days before the electors meet. And that's a lot of broad legal jargon there. I'll sort of break that down piece by piece. So the certification deadline is the date on which the state certifying official, that would be the governor in Arizona, has to issue a certificate of ascertainment. That's a piece of paper that says what the results are and who the electors are pledged to the winner of the state's electoral votes. This is essentially what legitimizes the win of a candidate within the state. It says who the electors will be, who meet 6 days later to cast their votes. So that has to happen on December 11th. When the rubber meets the road, what that means is that the election needs to be more or less cooked by that date. It needs to have a canvass that is complete. Recounts and contests need to be done. The governor needs to have clear results to certify. That is, I think, the major reform that the Arizona legislature and that the amazing folks on the ground who are working to advocate for this legislation, including folks on this call, that's what they were looking to try to anticipate. I think that's the major change, but there are a few others that I want to flag as well. The next one is clarifying that the governor is the official who issues that certificate. Now, states can appoint another official under state law, but it has to be someone else. Now, again, this is a little abstract, a little legalistic. Why does it matter? It matters because Congress wants to prevent competing slates of electors. You may have heard a little bit about in certain states there were so-called fake electors, slates of electors who were not actually those pledged to the candidate who won the most votes in the state, who then signed on to slips that went to Congress and said, we're the electors, count our electoral votes. This is making it clear. The slate of electors you count is what comes from the state certifying official, and that is presumptively the governor. This keeps a state legislature from stepping in and trying to issue its own electors or some other potential rogue state actor. Again, these are potential harms that are unlikely to come to pass, but we want to have systems in place to ensure that this doesn't happen. The next one is getting rid of a provision that existed under the old law that allowed the state legislature to essentially declare a failed election and appoint its own electors, basically saying that the voters in the state have failed to make a choice for whatever reason, and that the legislature or governor can essentially just, after the fact, appoint whatever electors it wants. You can see, obviously, the possibilities for sabotage that would come from a power like this. What the ECRA does is it gets rid of that. It creates a clear process that runs through a certifying official. The next one, and this is in a slightly different vein, has to do with the judicial process surrounding presidential electors. It creates so this is an expedited federal judicial proceeding for handling these issues, right? So this is making sure so that things can get done within the prescribed timeline, that any litigation that happens under the ECRA, it goes to a 3-judge panel of federal judges, and that 3-judge panel gets reviewed directly by the US Supreme Court. So there's a much faster timeline. Now, there can still be litigation around presidential elections, but if it concerns the specific mechanisms of the ECRA, so a governor issuing a certificate of ascertainment, that goes through a 3-judge panel. Now, again, I know this is a lot of legalistic type business, right? And I keep kind of coming back to this. This is a bit in the weeds. What's crucial about this is ensuring that the results are accurate, that they are ascertained quickly enough to give Congress the time to sort out these issues, and that no one bad faith actor can derail the whole process. And the next one definitely is, I think, one that folks are quite familiar with, which is that it clarifies what the vice president's role is in Congress when it comes to counting electoral votes. As I'm sure many of you heard, the Trump campaign had a theory that Mike Pence, the then vice president, on January 6, 2021, had the power to essentially throw out a bunch of electoral votes and throw the election to Donald Trump. There are a few steps in between, but the idea was that the vice president could unilaterally exercise the power to decide an election. The ECRA gets rid of all ambiguity around that. I think few thought there was ambiguity to begin with, but this gets rid of any potential ambiguity and says the vice president's job is ministerial. It basically says your job is to appoint tellers, people who actually read these votes, open up the envelope, give them to the tellers who read them into the record. You don't get to object. You don't get to change what the outcome is here. So again, you're noticing the theme, no one bad faith actor can derail the process, right? At any given moment, there is some form of relief that can come through review from another actor. If a governor decides that they will not award the state's electors to the person who got the most votes, there is a judicial review process that can correct that. If the vice president decides to unilaterally throw out electoral votes, it's clear that that role is purely ministerial and fall to Congress and or the courts to fix that. Now, the final piece here is that the Electoral Count Reform Act moves the date that the electors meet by 1 day. It moves it back by a day. So this gives states 1 extra day, technically, to get to that date. So there is a clear certification deadline. It's a firm deadline. But 6 days later, you have the meeting of the electors. That is the hardest stop in this process. That is a constitutionally fixed date, more or less. It doesn't say in the Constitution what the date is, but it says it has to be the same day. Federal law fixes that date now on this date. It's going to be December 17th, 2024. I believe it's set for the first, I believe it's the 3rd Tuesday in December. I always go back to my calendar and look at that, but for our purposes for this cycle, December 17th is when the electors meet. Certification deadline, December 11th, 6 days earlier. So those are the key portions of the ECRA. And this is what it fell to the states to try to implement. Now I'll kick it to Alex and Brian to explain what Arizona has done, right? But just to sort of clarify what the main portions for the states to figure out were, it was making sure that their post-election timeline were structured in such a way that the state would meet the certification deadline. So there's a lot of things that could keep a state from meeting that certification deadline. Recounts after the fact, a canvass that comes in late. We're thinking about potential avenues for delay. And so that is what it fell to states like Arizona to handle. And so I won't go too much into what the sort of law was here, but I will just add, that the folks on the ground, Alex and Brian included, did a phenomenal job. And many, many people here, Penny as well, folks did a great job in working with the legislature to get the necessary legislation passed. But I will let the other folks here speak to that. And thanks to you all for letting me speak here.
Penny, do you just want us to forge ahead, or you want to take some questions now? Forge ahead?
I think pausing for questions might be a good idea now that you flag it, Alex, since I know I just covered a bunch of information. But I will defer to the group on that.
Yeah, so I just, sorry. I don't see any questions in the chat unless there are direct questions to you all.
Sorry, Penny, I think one thing I'll flag, I don't know if folks can post questions into the chat.
They can to you, to the hosts only.
Oh, got it. Oh, perfect. Okay, so then, yeah, got it.
Okay,
Yeah,
all right,
there's no
okay.
chat, I didn't see any, but yeah, that makes sense.
Spencer, part of the reason we don't actually open it up because it is open to the public and we want to avoid any partisan
Right.
comments in the chat. So it's primarily to the hosts only. Alex, I don't see any questions, so we should proceed to the next stage, which is you and Brian's presentation. So Brian, you can share your screen as you clearly are able to. So I'll take it away, Alex and Brian.
All right. Well, I'll start out. I'm Alex Sculata. I'm the Arizona State Director for All Voting is Local and All Voting is Local Action. And with me today is Brian Garcia, our Senior Manager of Special Projects. I think what I would add, just in terms of setup, in terms of context, is that one of the reasons that this problem was complicated or worse in Arizona was the changes to the recount law that we passed a couple of sessions ago. Folks may remember Senator Ugenti Rita had a bill, I think it was two or three legislative sessions ago, I think 2 legislative sessions ago, that changed the recount threshold from 0.1% to 0.5%. So we increased by 5-fold the range that would allow an automatic recount funded by the taxpayers. And so that just means that there are many more recounts. Recounts were rare before, and now recounts are going to be normal unless we change that law back at some point in the future. But so the changes to the recounts made a big difference. The other thing is guess what? We actually had a really poorly written and not well drafted or thoughtful recount process, but we just didn't know that because it almost was never used because the threshold was so low. So not only did we increase by 5-fold the chances that we would have a recount, but we didn't understand or realize that our processes for managing recounts were really poorly designed, hadn't been thought through, and most importantly, did not have any real hard deadlines, right? And so now we're pushed up against a time pressure and realize our recounts don't really have the kinds of deadlines that we need them to have to be able to actually process recounts in a timely fashion. And now almost every election will have recounts. So there was the change to the Electoral Count Reform Act, but there were also the changes to Arizona law around recounts. Both of those things came together. And, we spend a lot of time with the league, with Penny, with other folks planning for, against anti-election subversion activities. There's nothing that an election denier, there's nothing that a person who wants to undermine our election wants more than chaos. And we basically had a recipe for chaos after the 2024 election if this piece of legislation didn't pass. And that's why many people, the governor's office, secretary of state, others really made it a high priority, and election officials, to try and pass this piece of legislation. So I'll stop there. I'll turn it over to Brian. We're going to go back and forth and talk about the things that the law we passed in Arizona did and how it'll change future elections. Brian?
All right. Thanks, Alex. And thank you, Penny, for having us. And I also want to, say a huge shout out and thank you to Penny as well for all the work that she did during the rapid response around this. And so excited to talk about the breakdown with you all. And just so everyone has a kind of a fundamental foundation for kind of what we'll be talking about, for folks who are interested, can look at the bill, and the bill is HB 2785. Should you want to go and dig a little deeper. But we'll start off with some key high-level changes. We won't talk about all the changes because there's a lot, and some things are technical and others are not, but obviously want to give you the high-level information. So the first one to start off is the primary election date for 2024. Now this is changed to July 30th. This is temporary and only for 2024. There's a lot of negotiations around whether it should be moved up until May or even moved at all. Obviously, this has impact on obviously on our election officials and how they move and operate within the deadlines. This also has an impact on a handful of tribal governments because they tend to line up their own elections with state elections. And so generally this moves up other deadlines by a week, whether that be the candidate signature, etc. But for us and for our purposes, voter registration and early voting beginning July 1st. And so that is the first one. We anticipate seeing some type of bill in the future because of the effort to move up the primary election, but obviously those are discussions to be had at a later time. But we'll pass it over to Alex to talk about the early voting provision.
Great, thanks, Brian. And one of the biggest reasons for moving the primary and dealing with that issue was just the fact that election officials were concerned about being able to get ballots to UOCAVA voters in a timely fashion. Those need to be mailed 45 days before the fall election, and they were concerned they might not know who won if it was a close election and there were recounts if the date wasn't moved. They were concerned they couldn't get enough days to be able to process the ballots and determine who won. So on early voting, a couple of different things here. A good thing, processing and tabulation of individual ballots may begin immediately upon receipt and can continue without delay until completed. So if there was any question, it's clear now that, in fact, ballot tabulation can be happening during the period of voting. Once people start early voting, we can have ballot tabulation on an ongoing basis, which means that those results can then get reported in a timely fashion on election day. Second thing is that the small change, but good for voters, in that it used to be that early voting ended at 5 p.m. On the Friday that early voting ended, and some voters were often confused about that because election day it's till 7 p.m. And so we extended until 7 p.m. on the Friday before the last weekend, that early voting can remain open until 7 p.m. And that, I think, is another positive thing. To be able to give voters extra time and to establish that folks can vote until 7 p.m. And then the last one was more controversial. There have been efforts in the past to require everyone who drops off a ballot on election day at a polling place to show ID. The reason for that is to, in fact, be able to stamp those ballots as basically validated so that they don't have to go through signature verification, and it would save some time. But if everyone had to do it, everyone would have to stand in line to do it, just like everyone who's standing in line to vote. And it would really change the way that people are used to voting who drop off their ballots. And so what we've done is this law says that voters should be provided that option, but this particular one is delayed because I think election officials and everyone agreed that we don't want to do this if it's done in a way where everyone has to stand in line. And so the election officials are going to have to change their processes some and their signage and other things so that there's a way, if you just want to drop your ballot off the way you do now without checking your ID, there's a path for that, and you don't have to stand in line to do it. And then if folks do want to check their ID and have their ballot basically made ready for tabulation by showing their ID, they'll have the option to do that, and that'll be a separate path. And that's part of why that one was put off until 2026, so that election officials can set up the infrastructure to do that in a way that doesn't create long lines. Brian?
All right, now let's talk about some ballot curing. We got a handful of changes here. So let's start off with a temporary change that we do have until the end of the 2026 elections. That includes a federal office. And so primarily supposed to cover 2024 and 2026 because of obviously inherently including those federal offices in those elections. And for those, we'll now have 5 calendar days for ballot curing instead of what we previously had is 5 business days. Obviously, that is not the same. We would have more time to be able to cure these ballots, and so it's essentially a cut right to the cure, but on a temporary basis. And so, after the 2026 elections, reverting back to the 5 business days. There is a change similar to to include those elections with the federal office, the hours of operation for ballot curing. Open during regular business hours, during the Friday and the weekend before and the Friday and the weekend after election day. And some folks might say, well, is this really a change? In some counties, right, like up north, where they wouldn't be open on Fridays, now are open on Fridays because of the change. And so that I think is important to note. And something new that I think will be helpful all around is the daily reports of ballots. Each county must submit those daily reports to the political parties of all voted, whose signatures are missing or mismatched. And that begins at the time that the first one is identified that is missing or mismatched. And then after election day, daily reports are also submitted for all those voters who have mismatched signatures or conditional provisional ballots. So this is something that was right amongst the negotiations to be able to identify and accommodate for the different changes regarding the ballot cured window and period. Alex, do you have anything else to add on this piece?
Just that last one will allow chase, will allow us to track down and chase down voters who have ballots that attempted to vote and, for whatever reason, their vote hasn't been counted. And it gives the parties, if you will, time to actually try and get those voters to cure their ballots before. And getting the daily reports from the beginning of early voting is a huge change.
Brian, if I could interrupt for just a second with a question, okay? There might be some confusion, I think, on this, but I think we should clarify it. Voting results, which is not the same thing as what we're talking about in this reports. This reports is those who have not cured their ballot and are on the cured list. And you should not confuse that with the voting results. Voting results are provided by the counties ongoing after, I believe it's after election day, Brian and Alex, okay? Nothing is ever reported before 7 p.m. as I recall, okay?
Correct, yeah, and we'll talk about canvassing and certification here in a bit.
Okay.
But yeah, you are correct.
Right.
These are about the curing of the ballots that, in order to be counted.
And if they're not cured, they can be counted. So we need, as a league, I just want to point out, we'll be doing some ballot chasing work to help, voters who need to get their ballots cured, to call back and do the needful.
So the next provision is just signature verification. The Secretary Hobbs, when she was Secretary of State, had a signature verification guide, which has sort of the processes for validating signatures. And there's been a push to codify that, to put it in the statutes. And so this, essentially does that. It does have a clear provision that that putting this guide into the statute is not intended to modify the grounds for challenging early ballots or to require an exact match. And those were some protections that were fought for, against putting this in the statute. I think that originally Governor Hobbs had vetoed a bill last cycle that did just this, saying it's really too much specificity to put into the statute, and it's harder to change then when if the best thinking about signature verification changes, it's harder to change it if it's codified in the statute. But as a compromise to get this done, to be able to meet our deadline, this was a compromise that was made, as this was put in, but with the clear language that it does not modify grounds for challenging early ballots, and it does not require an exact match. Brian?
All right, and now to Penny, your point earlier around canvassing and certification. So we have some good changes here that I'm certainly excited about, particularly on the county side of things, right? As you all, I'm sure, are familiar with, the delay in canvassing election results in Cochise County, and then right in the efforts up in Mojave County. And so these primarily go to address those pieces, but also to keep in mind the timeline and making sure that we're able to get things done on time. With the Board of Supervisors, they must canvass the election no later than, for the primary, the second Monday after the election, and for the general, the third Thursday after the election. And this just kind of tightens it up, because we didn't have kind of a clear guidance on when the canvassing and certification must happen. Certainly for the Secretary of State, there's now clarity around when those must be canvassed for the primary and the general. And then this also prohibits, to the point I mentioned earlier, from the Board of Supervisors from postponing the canvass of the primary and general elections. And this is just helpful, because it reinforces that the role in canvassing certification is ministerial, and allows us to kind of move forward and prevent from voters being disenfranchised. And so these are good changes, and hopefully when in practice and we see it rolled out, that it'll be good for the long haul.
Brian, before you
yes.
move beyond this, I'm going to interrupt just for a second and ask you, it might be worth it to clarify the word canvas, because as activists, we do a certain kind of canvassing going out to, and I think that gets very confusing in people's mind. So it is really important probably for us to be spell out exactly what are we saying when we use the word canvas over here. That'll be very helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. No, thank you so much. And I'm glad you brought that up, because when I made the switch into election work, I had kind of a similar pause of, wait, we're not canvassing door to door. What is this? We're not operating in a field, right? But for the purposes of the Board of Supervisors and what canvassing means, essentially saying that we have brought in all the precincts. We have the report of the turnout, the amount of votes for each office and what that looks like, and we're basically saying, yep, these are everything here is essentially accurate. And now that we have canvassed this, we will now certify these results. And so for our purposes, when we're saying canvass, we're basically getting a full readout of all the election details that allows the Board of Supervisors to conduct their ministerial duty to certify the election and deliver those to the Secretary of State so they can be included in the statewide count. And Alex, I don't know if you have anything else on canvassing and certification.
This was a big one, is making the counties finish their work earlier, so that then we can get the recounts done by December 11th, which is when the governor and secretary of state need to act.
And also I will note that we did an analysis on the amount of time spent by each particular county for a handful of elections. Majority, if not most, ended up canvassing significantly earlier. And so this really aligns with what has already been going in practice and just kind of cuts off and prevents the subversion pieces from it. Alex?
Yeah, and this is the last, I think the last point we're going to make, and then we're going to take questions because this is complicated stuff. So the last thing is, and it was, I referenced it at the beginning, is that our recount did not have really good deadlines, and the mechanisms for triggering it were just were not very thoughtful. So for example, we had to wait until after state certification to like trigger a recount, and the end of the county canvases and the secretary of state canvass were a week apart. So we basically, even though we knew we were going to have recounts, we had to wait a week till we could actually have the state certification before we could start the recount. This allows the secretary of state to go ahead and let the court know that we're going to need a recount within 24 hours after the last county canvasses, if the county canvasses show that the recount is required. So if each of the counties canvass and the margin is small enough to fall within that variance, even though the state certification, the state canvass and certification hasn't happened, we're going to use that to trigger the recount so that we can start doing the recounts. There's also some changes in logic and accuracy testing so that they can actually recalibrate and test the machines before the recounts. And then finally, it allows the required hand count audit of the results to be performed before the machine tabulation is complete, which means that if they tabulate for a day, they can start the hand count on that day's results, and they don't have to wait all the way to the end of the tabulation to then do the random hand count. They can start doing the random hand count, if you will, in batches. As each batch a day, say for example, is tabulated, then that day using that day's results, they can do a hand audit of those results and do that, if you will, piecemeal as the tabulated results are being done, to speed up that process so that when they get to the end of the tabulation, they can relatively quickly finish it and get the clerk to certify the results. So I think we're going to stop there. Do we have anything else, Brian? Just our contact sheet, I guess. So I think we're going to stop there, Penny. That's a lot of information that impacts many things, and we'd love to open it up for questions for folks.
Brian, if you could actually put those links in the chat, people can pick up on it, okay? Especially the democracy link in the chat to everyone, that'll be great. They can pick that up. I'm going to stop your share so we can open it up for questions. I have some targeted questions to sort of make sure everybody understood what it was you're saying, because this is a complex. I think it hit it hit the general public unawares, if you will, okay? And we all had to mobilize rather fast to both alert the public and mobilize to get the right end result that we hopefully have at this stage. So Spencer, I'll start with you first. If you can talk a little bit about what you saw in Arizona versus what you think is going to happen in other states, or where there are still problems. And I think it's good for us to hear that.
Yeah, so I think in Arizona, I'm just looking back to what made Arizona stand out. And I think it's what Alex flagged at the very start of his remarks, which is that Arizona had passed a new law that had made recounts substantially more likely. And with that comes greater concerns about delays post-election, right? The 2020 presidential election in Arizona, were it administered under this new law, would have gone to a recount. And so I think that was one thing that stood out that gave us particular concern, but also that there was a particularly long post-election timeline that didn't have a ton of deadlines. There were moments in the recount process that were somewhat open-ended. The Secretary of State certifying facts to the court requiring a recount. Basically, the Secretary of State starting the recount process did not have a deadline at all. And then there was a county canvass and a statewide canvass that went into very late into the month. So I think those are the things that in particular stood out. I think there are things that other states have to contend with that Arizona did not. But I think those were the major issues that in particular stood out to me, was this post-election timeline issue.
Alex and Brian, you want to talk a little bit about the way forward? Is this legislation a Band-Aid, or is it a decent fix that'll hold us in good stead as we go forward into barring the legislature coming up with something strange, but can you speak to that,
Well, I mean, it's a compromise, right? A compromise, means, both sides give and take. I do think that for most of the things, I think the governor's office was very strong about not really wanting to have this solution harm voters. And there is a cut to the cure for two elections that many of us were against. It was written in a way that unless there is new legislation, that cut ends in 2 cycles, right? The change to the primary is just.
Brian, I think Alex froze.
A way to fix that. We're going to have to come back, right? So, there are some temporary things.
Brian, can you fill in? Poor Alex, I think he's freezing.
Oh, sorry, is my sound bad?
Well, you were freezing, so we missed. So if you can repeat the last few things that you said, they were very important, I think,
I apologize.
No
if I
worries.
get closer, maybe my computer will cooperate better, right? I was just saying that I think that it's really important that some of these things that were changes were made temporary so that we have to address them again, rather than to permanently harm voters, for example, by cutting the cure.
Right.
Brian?
And I would add that there are things that I think are important to revisit to prevent confusion, intimidation, and disenfranchising voters on the optional ID requirement that will start in 2026, right? Like, we still have time to address that, but that is assuming, right, that there are more pro-democracy, more pro-voter legislators at the legislature. And I mean, just the fact that you would have to interact, right, with a poll worker and be asked if you would like to optionally provide your ID creates another layer of confusion and intimidation for folks who really just want to avoid all of that. And also with the kind of in practice, what it'll look like, right, when you're being asked if you'd like to provide optional ID, when there's already confusion with poll workers on, what is a proper ID, and particularly when it comes to like tribal voters and tribal ID, because not everyone is properly trained on those, and turn voters away and potentially risk disenfranchising them. So I think, like Alex mentioned, it's a compromise bill. I think it's an acceptable bill for the time being. We'll get to see and reflect on to what the impacts are. But I think for the pieces that are concerning to me, particularly around optional voter ID, I think that is still a fight left to have.
Brian, I think I want to pull that conversation in a little bit more deeper, because one of the things is we say optional ID. What do we mean by that? I think let's not leave out what that context is, because the people hearing this discussion need to know what was being proposed and is still problematic. And so if you can talk about, what are we talking about? We're not talking about IDs when they come to vote in the polling location, to get a ballot. What are we talking about?
Yeah, of course. So we're specifically talking about early ballots, right, that were mailed that are being dropped off at a polling location. And so, right, normally you'd go in and be able to drop it off without having to essentially interact with a poll worker. This is an intervention and interrupts that to the point where now you are essentially stopped by a poll worker and asked if you'd like to provide your ID. Now, how that training will break down is yet to be seen, right? And how that will work out in practice. But it's essentially an extension of the kind of the efforts to undermine voters with strict voter ID laws, right? That we've seen around the country, and wanting to make sure that for whatever reason, but the ultimate impact being to intimidate and disenfranchise voters, and particularly voters of color. And so this is right. And the reason why it's concerning is because we've seen how they've been weaponized before. And with, concerns around what we used to have pre-clearance, right? And how it would impact the state overall, whether even this would be considered, right? But I think in the long term, has more of a negative impact than it does positive, than it's what they designed it to be.
Brian, I'm going to
as-
interrupt for just a minute because I don't think we've actually explained what we're talking about and leave people confused. I believe that what you are saying is that, and Alex, correct me, is that when you go drop off your ballot, and almost 100% of the people who are on this call are mail ballot users, okay? I can guarantee that, okay? When we are used to either putting it in the mailbox or going by and dropping it off in a mail, in a ballot box, what this legislation is proposing is that when you stop by, they're going to give you the conveniences the way that, no, it didn't pass, Alex?
We don't know. Okay. So
Okay.
I just sort of want to overreact. Okay. Like it could be bad. There's a whole cycle. Part of the reason it's in 2026 is the Secretary of State's election procedures manual in 2025, I am certain, will address the processes for doing these. And I think we're all going to be fighting to make sure they're addressed in a way that doesn't create the kind of problem that we're talking about. So I would say, if I were writing the election procedures manual in 2025, it would say that there be clear signage that ballot drop off only is here. Optional ID check-in to drop off ballot is here. And there are two separate lines. You don't have to interact with anyone. You don't have to talk to anyone. There's a clear sign. There's this path with no line, and there's this path with a line. Somebody asked me, why would anyone want to optionally show an ID? I don't know. I think part of it is because it's a slippery slope, because there are some people who would like everyone to have to show an ID. And so that's the dark side of this, right? Is that there are some people who would like to make everyone who's going to drop off a ballot show an ID. On the other hand, maybe some people want to say, I want to save election officials the time. And so I'm guessing the county's going to have, hey, if you have time to show your ID, show your ID. That saves us the time of signature verification. And then we can stamp your ballot and it can go straight to tabulation and it doesn't have to go to signature verification.
So Alex, I want to clarify, okay?
Yeah.
The concept of showing your ID when you drop off your ballot is that if you should choose to do that, then they would save the election officials a second layer of signature verification of the ballot. Is that accurate?
Yes, it would get stamped and it'll go into a ready for tabulation pile rather than normally it would have to go to a signature verification process and then it would be ready for tabulation.
Okay. So to clarify for everybody, what we're talking about is you can drop off the ballot or you can choose to show your ID, in which case, depending on the training the poll workers get and how they set up the process, it could get stamped and that would be processed directly for tabulation versus the one where you just drop it off with no ID verification. That I wanted to be sure we all understood what those options meant, whether we agree with what their intention behind it or not, or how they're going to implement it. I wanted to be sure everybody understood clearly what we are meaning by those options. And this is only for drop-off ballots, everybody, okay? This doesn't have anything to do with you going into a polling location and receiving a ballot at early voting or on the day of voting, okay?
And I have the same concerns Brian has. It's just, I'm hopeful that there are ways we can sort of mitigate the potential harm that this has, primarily through working with the EPM process next year and making sure that there are sort of clear required processes that make sure that folks that are used to just dropping off their ballot in a ballot drop box are allowed to do that without interference. And I think we can fight for that in the EPM.
I think I'm glad, Brian, you brought up the optional. I'm glad we had that clarifying discussion, because I knew I could see people were, wait, what are you talking about? Okay, so as we, continue to carry the road show, we might want to take a little time also to flesh that out. I think part of our work as the coalition will be educating all these members and others about exactly what are the options and what do they mean, despite all our misgivings about what the intentions might be and how it might actually play out. Okay. I don't see, do you all have any more questions? We're at 1:06. We had planned this event to be about 60 minutes, plus if you were fired up and had a ton of questions. I don't see that. The thing about a lunch and learn is everybody's waiting to go eat lunch. So, it cuts our ability to drag it out. There are some general concerns I would like to elevate about the Board of Supervisors and elections officials, including administrators and so on, and the presence of election deniers in many of those positions, including current resignations from Board of Supervisors. Alex and Brian, we've had lengthy conversations about these. Do you want to just weigh in on that before we wrap up? I know you are
all I'll say is the Board of Supervisors matters. If you didn't think the Board of Supervisors mattered, to your vote for president or to your vote for your state legislature, now everyone probably knows that the Board of Supervisors matters. And there are some anti-election, election denying people running for the boards of supervisors in many places in Arizona. And so we should be advised that those races really matter and they have an impact. And in fact, the Maricopa County Board of Supervisors, political parties aside, have done a really incredible job in the last 2 years trying to make sure that anti-democracy folks haven't been able to upend our elections. And I think they all come from one political party, or almost all of them do. And so it's not about R's or D's. It's really about people who believe in our elections and want to protect our elections, and people who in fact think that they can seize power by undermining them. And I think that's where we need to focus.
There are two questions I think worth us delving into. One is, if a recount is required, is it always by hand? Can we clarify that? That question's being asked because there's some confusion around that. Okay.
The recounts are not by hand. The recounts are just like the original. They're machine tabulated with a hand count audit of 1% of the mail-in ballots or 2% of the polling place cast ballot. So it's the hand count is just the limited hand count audit that we've always had in Arizona. So they're tabulated by the mechanical tabulators, and then there's a limited hand count audit, just as there is for the regular election.
Alex and Brian, another question is, will the ECRA prevent any outsiders, private companies coming to Arizona in the future? Not quite sure where a private company would come in. Spencer's fight warding off family and friends in the background, probably.
No, sorry, it was was my dog who was just like barking like nuts. So I was telling her to be quiet. She's quite a feisty little one.
I wonder if the question was tied to the sham audit we had in Arizona, if that could, have any impact, if the ECRA protects against that.
Spencer can jump in. I don't really see any way to protect against the legislature's abuse of its own subpoena power, but yeah, I don't see a way.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think the ECRA supplies that sort of avenue, but I think the good news is that it's abuse. I think the legislative subpoena power, right? It's not going to be able to overturn the result of an election. It's its own distinct threat to public confidence in our election system, but it cannot, of its own power, change what the outcome is going to be or subvert the presidential election.
All right, it's 1:11. I want to thank Spencer, thank Alex and Brian for really an excellent presentation. This is new. It's hit a lot of our folks like, what is the ECRA? So we're very grateful for really a wonderful presentation. And thank you all who are on the call for giving up your lunch or eating your lunch while you listen to a very, very deep but very important topic for us in Arizona and across the country. We wish you all a wonderful rest of the day. Please don't forget, we have another session tomorrow, and tomorrow is about AI and deep fakes in elections. So if you haven't registered for it, do join us. Jonah Minkoff-Zern from Public Citizen will be speaking about it. We work very hard, the league, with Jonah to help bring forward Senator Sundaresan worked very hard to bring forward a legislation, but was co-opted by Senator Carroll. And that legislation is moving forward. We support it as the league. It is a way to protect and make sure that what's out there, the truth is out there, and that we're all hearing it, okay, and not some kind of deep fake. See you all tomorrow. If you know someone who wants to know about AI and didn't show up today, call them up and have them register. Spencer, thank you. Alex, thank you. Brian, thank you. The league thanks you all for your time and support of the work that we all do together.